My name is Emma Rodriguez, and at my sister's wedding reception, they seated me at table 12. What I quickly realized was the designated disappointments table. You know, the one: the unemployed cousin, the recent divorcee, the struggling freelancer, and me, the family member who works in events and apparently never figured out how to make anything of herself. I watched my sister Jessica float around Rosewood Manor in her designer gown, accepting congratulations and gifts, while her new husband's best man made increasingly loud comments about supporting deadweight relatives and expensive venues for people who can't afford them. That's when I decided it was time to make an announcement that would turn their perfect evening upside down. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up in a cramped apartment in Queens, Jessica and I shared everything: clothes, secrets, dreams about the lives we'd build when we escaped to something better. But even then, our parents saw us differently. Jessica had the grades that made teachers smile, and the personality that made relatives slip her extra birthday money. She collected academic awards like other kids collected stickers, each achievement earning her a spot of honor on the refrigerator and another story for mom to share at the grocery store. I was the organizer, the one who remembered everyone's birthdays, planned surprise parties with whatever budget I could scrape together, and somehow made sure every family gathering ran smoothly. When our quinceañera celebrations came around, Jessica's was all about her dress and her court, while I was the one coordinating vendors, managing timelines, and making sure the hall looked perfect. "Emma's so helpful," relatives would say, patting my shoulder before turning back to compliment Jessica on her poise. By high school, the pattern was set. Jessica sailed through AP classes while I took business courses that my guidance counselor described as practical. Jessica got into a private college with scholarship money. I went to state school and worked nights at a catering company to pay my way. Our parents beamed when Jessica brought home Dean's List certificates and internship offers. When I mentioned starting my own event planning business during junior year, Dad nodded absently and asked if I'd considered getting a teaching certificate instead, something more stable for a woman. The thing about being underestimated is that it gives you a different kind of freedom. While Jessica felt the pressure of maintaining her golden child status, I learned to move quietly, building something real without the weight of expectations. I discovered I had an eye for logistics that went far beyond party planning. I could see inefficiencies, optimize budgets, and turn chaos into seamless experiences. More importantly, I understood that the events industry wasn't just about decorations and catering, it was about real estate, vendor relationships, and creating experiences that people would pay premium prices for. After college, the gap between Jessica and me seemed to widen even further. She landed a marketing job at a Manhattan advertising agency, complete with a corner office and expense account lunches. Her Instagram filled with shots of client presentations, team-building retreats, and networking events at trendy rooftops. She moved to a studio apartment in Brooklyn Heights that cost more than our parents' mortgage, but it looked sophisticated in her carefully curated posts. Meanwhile, I was working 18-hour days, coordinating corporate events during the week and weddings on weekends. I lived in a modest one-bedroom in Astoria, driving a used Honda that had more miles than most commercial airlines. To my family, this looked like struggling. They saw me rushing from event to event, always tired, always busy, never talking about vacation plans or expensive purchases. When Jessica got promoted to senior marketing coordinator, Mom threw her a celebration dinner. When I landed my first six-figure corporate client, I mentioned it quietly and received polite nods before the conversation shifted to Jessica's latest campaign success. The truth was, I was building something bigger than a job. I was creating an empire. Every corporate gala I organized, every wedding I executed flawlessly, every vendor relationship I cultivated was another brick in a foundation that my family couldn't see. I wasn't just planning events, I was learning every aspect of the hospitality business from the ground up. I understood profit margins, seasonal trends, vendor negotiations, and most importantly, I knew which properties had potential and which were overpriced disasters waiting to happen. By the time Jessica announced her engagement to Michael Chen, a software developer she'd met through work, I had quietly acquired my first venue, a small but elegant space in Westchester that I renovated and turned into a boutique wedding destination. The profit from that investment, combined with my growing corporate client base, allowed me to purchase 2 more properties within the next 18 months. I reinvested everything, living modestly while my business portfolio expanded. Jessica's engagement party was everything you'd expect: perfectly coordinated social media announcements, a surprise proposal at her favorite restaurant, followed by champagne toasts with their circle of young professionals. I was invited, naturally, and I brought a nice bottle of wine and smiled through stories about their startup life in California and their plans for a dream wedding back east. When Jessica started venue shopping, she fell in love with Rosewood Manor immediately. Built in the 1920s, the estate featured a grand ballroom with crystal chandeliers, French doors that opened onto manicured gardens, and the kind of old-world elegance that made every bride feel like royalty. It was also completely out of their budget. I watched Jessica's face fall when the event coordinator quoted the price, saw Michael's jaw tighten as he calculated numbers on his phone. "Maybe we can find something similar," he said diplomatically, but Jessica's shoulders had already slumped with disappointment. That's when I made a decision that no one in my family would understand, because they had no idea who I actually was or what I was capable of. 6 months before Jessica's wedding, I bought Rosewood Manor. It wasn't a romantic gesture or a family charity case, it was a smart business investment. The previous owners were struggling with debt and eager to sell below market value. The property had incredible potential but needed someone with industry connections and renovation capital to unlock it. I saw what it could become, not just Jessica's dream venue, but the crown jewel of my expanding business empire. I kept the purchase quiet, working through lawyers and business entities to maintain privacy. The existing staff stayed on, and to anyone who asked, I was simply a consultant helping with the transition. When Jessica called to tell me they'd somehow gotten a payment plan that made Rosewood Manor affordable for their wedding, I expressed appropriate excitement and offered to help with any planning details she needed. What she didn't know was that I'd structured the deal to make her dream wedding possible while maintaining the property's value and reputation. What no one in my family knew was that I now owned 4 properties across the tri-state area, employed 37 people, and had a business worth more than their collective annual salaries. The wedding planning process revealed everything I'd learned about my family's perception of me. Just preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Jessica would call with updates about dress fittings and menu tastings, occasionally asking if I could help coordinate some small details since I knew about party stuff. When complications arose, vendor conflicts, timeline issues, budget concerns, she'd mention them in passing, never considering that I might have solutions beyond offering moral support. The week before the wedding, Jessica had a minor breakdown about seating arrangements. "It's so complicated," she sighed during a phone call. "We have Michael's startup friends, my work people, family, and then there are the odd numbers, people who don't really fit anywhere." "What do you mean?" I asked, though I suspected I knew where this was heading. "Well, like you and Ryan and some of Michael's single friends who don't really know anyone. We're putting you all at table 12, kind of off to the side, so you can get to know each other. It'll be fun, like the kids' table but for adults who are still figuring things out." The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. Not because I cared about table assignments, but because it crystallized how my own sister saw me, as someone still figuring things out at 32, someone who belonged with the unemployed and the struggling. Someone whose success was so unimaginable that it never even occurred to her as a possibility. I almost said something then. The words were right there, balanced on my tongue, like a confession waiting to reshape everything between us. But something stopped me. Maybe it was curiosity about how far this could go, or maybe it was the strategic part of my brain, recognizing an opportunity for perfect timing. The morning of the wedding, I arrived at Rosewood Manor early to check on final preparations, not as the bride's sister, but as the owner, ensuring every detail met my standards. The staff greeted me with their usual professionalism, updating me on vendor arrivals, timeline adjustments, and the small issues that always arise on wedding days. I moved through the space I owned, solving problems and making decisions while wearing jeans and a casual blazer, knowing that in a few hours I'd return in formal attire to be seated with the failures. The ceremony was beautiful, everything Jessica had dreamed of. I watched from my assigned seat in the back, genuinely happy for her, as she exchanged vows with Michael in the garden she'd fallen in love with. The late September sunlight filtered through the trees, casting golden light on her dress and making the whole scene look like something from a magazine. She deserved this moment, this happiness, this perfect beginning to her married life. It was during cocktail hour that I first encountered Brad Morrison, Michael's best man and business partner. I'd heard about him through Jessica's story, the successful co-founder, the networking genius, the guy who'd convinced Michael to move to California for their startup's launch. In person, he was exactly what I'd expected, confident to the point of arrogance, dressed in an expensive suit that he wore like armor, with the kind of smile that never quite reached his eyes. I was standing near the bar, waiting for a glass of wine, when I overheard him talking to a group of wedding guests about the venue choice. Beautiful place, he was saying, gesturing around the ballroom with his martini glass, though I told Mike they were spending way too much on location. That's the problem with people who don't understand business. They get emotional about purchases instead of thinking strategically. One of Jessica's work friends, clearly impressed by his authority, asked about the startup world and making smart financial decisions. Brad launched into what sounded like a rehearsed speech about discipline, investment priorities, and the importance of surrounding yourself with other successful people who understood value creation. The thing about family, he continued, his voice carrying across the cocktail area, is that sometimes you have to make tough choices about enabling bad financial habits. Like tonight, we're celebrating in a venue that probably cost more than some people make in a year, but the bride's family insisted on keeping up appearances instead of being realistic about their budget. I felt heat rise in my chest, not because of the criticism of the expense, but because of his assumption about who was paying for what. He was talking about my property, my investment, my gift to my sister, with the casual superiority of someone who thought he understood a situation he knew nothing about. When dinner was announced, I made my way to table 12, tucked discreetly near the kitchen doors, far enough from the main action that conversations could flow without disturbing the important guests. My table mates were exactly who Jessica had described. Ryan, my cousin who'd graduated from college 6 months ago, and was still job hunting. Tom Wilson, a freelance graphic designer who'd known Michael since college, Angela Foster, a family friend going through a difficult divorce, and 2+1s who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. The conversation was stilted at first, the way it always is when strangers are forced together with only their perceived failures in common. Ryan talked about the challenges of the job market. Tom mentioned some freelance projects that weren't paying well, and Angela shared updates about starting over at 45. I listened, offered supportive comments, and watched the main party unfold at the more prestigious tables across the room. That's when Brad made his way over to our table. He'd clearly had a few drinks by this point, his confidence amplified into something closer to condescension. "Mind if I join you folks for a few minutes?" he asked, not waiting for an answer, before pulling up an empty chair. I wanted to meet some of Michael's extended family circle. His presence immediately changed the dynamic at our table. Ryan straightened up, probably hoping to make a good impression on someone who might have job connections. Tom started asking questions about the tech industry. Angela smiled politely, the way people do when they're not sure if they're being patronized. Brad seemed to enjoy the attention, launching into stories about startup life, successful exits, and the importance of making strategic choices in your 20s and 30s. His advice was delivered with the casual authority of someone who'd never doubted his own trajectory, never had to worry about student loans, or family obligations, or any of the complications that make success less straightforward for most people. "The key," he said, leaning back in his chair like he was holding court, "is recognizing opportunities and having the courage to take risks. Too many people get comfortable with mediocrity because it feels safe." I watched him survey our table, his gaze lingering on each of us, with the subtle assessment of someone categorizing our failures. When his eyes met mine, I saw the same dismissive glance I'd been receiving all day, polite acknowledgement of my existence without any real interest in who I might be. "Emma Ryan," he said, clearly proud of himself for remembering my name. "Jessica mentioned you work in events. That must be fun, getting to see behind the scenes of places like this." There was something in his tone that made my pulse quicken, the same subtle condescension I'd been hearing my entire life. The assumption that my work was frivolous, that my perspective was limited, that my experience was somehow less valuable than his insights about business and success. "It has its moments," I replied carefully, taking a sip of wine while studying his face. "I bet," he continued, warming to his subject. "Though I have to say, whoever's paying for this place tonight is probably making a mistake. Don't get me wrong, it's gorgeous, but the overhead on a property like this must be astronomical. The smart money would have gone with something more modest and invested the difference." Ryan nodded eagerly, probably hoping to impress Brad with his agreement. Tom made some comment about understanding budget constraints from his own event work. Angela looked uncomfortable, but didn't say anything. I set down my wine glass and looked directly at Brad. "What makes you think the overhead is too high?" He seemed pleased by the question, interpreting it as genuine interest rather than challenge. "Basic business principles," he explained. Properties like this, historic estates, premium locations, high maintenance costs. They're money pits, unless you're running them at capacity year-round. Most venue owners are emotional about their investments instead of analytical. Interesting theory, I said. What would you consider a reasonable profit margin for a property like this? Brad's smile widened, clearly enjoying the opportunity to demonstrate his business acumen to an appreciative audience. What you'd want to see at least 30% margins after all expenses, which means charging premium rates and maintaining high booking percentages. But most venues in this category are vanity projects for people who don't understand hospitality economics. I nodded thoughtfully, letting him continue his analysis of my business model, while I considered how much rope to give him before he hanged himself with it. The problem, he continued, his voice carrying to nearby tables, is that people get seduced by beautiful spaces without doing them. They think if they build it, customers will come, but they don't factor in marketing costs, seasonal fluctuations, competition from newer venues. It's basic stuff, really. That's when I made my decision. Not out of anger or spite, but with the same calculated precision I'd learned to use in every business negotiation. The timing was perfect, the audience was ideal, and Brad had just spent 10 minutes explaining why everything I'd built was financially. I stood up slowly, smoothing my dress, and picking up my wine glass. The gesture was casual enough that it didn't immediately draw attention from other tables, but deliberate enough that everyone at table 12 was watching. You know, Brad, I said, my voice carrying just enough to reach the nearby tables, where Jessica's friends and family were dining. You make some interesting points about venue and economics. I'd love to hear your thoughts on our booking strategy for next season. He looked confused for a moment, probably wondering why I was speaking like I had insider knowledge about Rosewood Manor's business operations. I'm sorry, he said. I smiled, taking a small step back so that my voice would carry clearly across the room. Since you've been analyzing the financial viability of this property all evening, I thought you might want to know that we're actually running at 68% margins this year, with bookings scheduled 18 months out, and a waiting list for premium dates. The conversation at nearby tables started to quiet as people turned to listen to what was happening at the failure table. Brad's expression shifted from confusion to wariness. That's when I delivered the line I'd been saving all evening. The sentence that would reframe everything he'd said. Everything my family believed about me. Everything this entire wedding represented about success and failure. And who gets to sit with? I'm the owner, I said simply. Welcome to my venue. The silence that followed my announcement stretched like a taut wire across the reception hall. Brad's martini glass froze halfway to his lips, his confident expression dissolving into something between shock and calculation. Around us, the ambient chatter of the wedding reception continued, but at the tables within earshot, conversations had stopped entirely. I could feel eyes turning toward our corner, curiosity rippling outward like stones dropped in still water. Brad set his glass down with deliberate care, his mind clearly racing to process what I just said. The man who had spent the last hour pontificating about business strategy and venue economics was now staring at the woman he'd dismissed as just another family disappointment, realizing she owned the very property he'd been critiquing. "You're joking," he said finally, his voice lacking its earlier certainty. I reached into my small evening purse and pulled out my phone, opening the property management app that connected me to Rosewood Manor's systems. With a few taps, I dimmed the ballroom's chandelier lights by 20%, then brought them back to full brightness. The effect was subtle but unmistakable. No guest would have access to those controls. "The lighting system is new," I said conversationally. "We upgraded to smart controls last bit. Much more efficient for different event types." Brad's face had gone pale beneath his California. Around us, my table mates were staring with expressions ranging from confusion to dying amazement. Ryan's mouth was literally hanging open. Tom Wilson had stopped mid-sentence in whatever he'd been saying to Angela. Even the plus ones who'd been checking their phones were now paying attention. But it wasn't just our table anymore. Jessica's work friends at the adjacent table had clearly heard my announcement, and I could see them whispering urgently among themselves. One of them, a woman I recognized from Jessica's Instagram posts, was staring at me with the kind of intense curiosity reserved for witnessing something unprecedented. From across the room, I caught my mother's eye. Patricia Rodriguez was standing near the head table, mid-conversation with one of Michael's relatives, but something in the sudden shift of energy had drawn her attention to our corner. She looked puzzled, sensing that something significant was happening, but unable to hear the details from her distance. Brad cleared his throat, attempting to regain his composure. "I mean, congratulations on the investment," he said. his tone now artificially measured. When did you acquire the property? 6 months ago, I replied, settling back into my chair, as if we were discussing the weather. The previous owners were motivated sellers. Sometimes the best opportunities come from understanding market conditions that others miss. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was using his own language, his business speak confidence, to explain how I'd succeeded in exactly the kind of deal he'd spent the evening claiming was financially impossible. But I could see his analytical mind working, trying to reconcile the numbers, the timeline, the implications of what I was telling him. Angela Foster leaned forward, her eyes wide. Emma, are you saying you bought this place for Jessica's wedding? That question drew even more attention from nearby tables. The romantic notion of someone purchasing an entire estate for their sister's dream wedding was exactly the kind of story that would spread through a reception like wildfire. But it also missed the larger point, the business reality that made the gesture possible. Not exactly, I said, choosing my words carefully. I bought it because it was an excellent investment opportunity that happened to align with Jessica's wedding timeline. The fact that she'd fallen in love with this venue was a bonus, not the primary motivation. Brad was studying me now with the focused intensity of someone reassessing a fundamental assumption. What's your background in hospitality? He asked, and I could hear him trying to piece together how he'd so completely misread the situation. 15 years in event management and venue operations, I said. I started with corporate events, moved into high-end weddings, then began acquiring properties about 5 years ago. Rosewood Manor is my fourth venue. The number hit the table like a small explosion. Ryan actually choked on his drink. Tom Wilson sat back in his chair as if he'd been physically pushed. Even the conversations at surrounding tables seemed to pause as the implications sank in. 4 venues. Not just this one property, not just a lucky investment, but an entire portfolio of businesses that I'd built while everyone in my family thought I was struggling to pay rent on a modest apartment. 4 venues, Tom repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, taking a sip of wine, while maintaining eye contact with Brad. The Meadowbrook Estate in Connecticut, Harborview Pavilion on Long Island, and the Ashford House in New Jersey. We handle everything from intimate ceremonies to corporate galas for Fortune 500 companies. Brad's expression had shifted completely now. The condescending confidence was gone, replaced by the sharp focus of someone recognizing that he'd drastically underestimated the person sitting across from him. More than that, he was beginning to understand that his entire analysis of venue economics had just been dismantled by someone who actually owned and operated multiple properties in the market he'd been dismissing. What kind of annual revenue are we talking about? He asked, and I could hear the genuine curiosity beneath the question. This wasn't social small talk anymore. It was one business owner trying to understand another's operation. I smiled, the same polite expression I'd been wearing all evening, but now it carried a different weight. That's not really dinner conversation, is it? The deflection was deliberate, professional, the kind of boundary that successful business owners maintain about proprietary information. But it also served another purpose. It demonstrated that I wasn't trying to impress him or prove anything beyond what I'd already established. I didn't need his validation or his understanding of my success. Around us, the reception continued its elegant progression. The band had transitioned from cocktail jazz to more upbeat dinner music, and servers were moving efficiently between tables, refilling wine glasses and clearing salad plates. But our corner of the room had become its own micro-environment, a bubble of revelation and recalibration that existed separately from the celebration flowing around us. Ryan finally found his voice. Emma, why didn't you ever tell us about this? About any of this? It was the question I'd been expecting, the one that got to the heart of everything wrong with my family's dynamics. How do you explain to someone that you stopped sharing your successes because they consistently failed to see them as successes? How do you describe the exhaustion of constantly correcting people's assumptions about your life, your work, your capabilities? What would I have told you? I asked gently. At Thanksgiving dinner when everyone was celebrating Jessica's promotion. During Christmas, when the conversation was about her new apartment. At Easter when Mom spent an hour showing everyone pictures of her latest work conference. Ryan looked uncomfortable, probably remembering some of those exact conversations. Angela was nodding slowly, recognition dawning in her eyes. Even Tom seemed to understand what I was describing. The experience of being overlooked so consistently that you eventually stop trying to be seen. But it was Brad's reaction that interested me most. He was listening with the intensity of someone who recognized a business lesson unfolding, a case study in assumptions and market assessment that he'd never considered before. The successful entrepreneur, who prided himself on reading people and situations, was realizing that he'd completely misread both.
So when Jessica was stressing about venue cost, Angela said slowly, "You could have just told her you owned the place." "I could have," I agreed. "But then this wouldn't have been her wedding anymore. It would have been Emma's charity case, Emma's way of showing off, Emma finally doing something useful for the family. She deserved to feel like she'd earned her dream wedding, not like it was a gift she couldn't afford." The complexity of that decision seemed to resonate around the table. I'd protected my sister's dignity, while enabling her dreams, maintained my own privacy, while solving her problems, and created a situation where everyone got what they
wanted without anyone having to acknowledge the financial reality that made it possible. Except now that reality was out in the open, spreading through the reception like ripples in a pond. I could see Jessica's maid of honor, Sarah Kim, leaning over to whisper something urgent to the bride. Jessica's head turned toward our table, her expression shifting from confusion to concern as she tried to understand what was happening in the corner where they'd seated the failures. My father, Carlos, was also watching now, his weathered hands paused over his dinner plate as he tracked the unusual energy emanating from table 12. He'd spent 40 years as an electrician, understanding buildings and systems and the infrastructure that made things work. Maybe he'd recognize the symmetry of his daughter owning the infrastructure that was making this entire evening possible. Brad leaned forward, his voice lowered to avoid drawing more attention from other tables. "Can I ask you something directly?" I nodded. "How did you finance the acquisitions?" 4 properties, renovation costs, operating capital, that's serious money, especially starting from event planning. It was a fair question, the kind that any business owner would ask when trying to understand another's growth strategy. But it was also the question that revealed how much he still didn't understand about my background, my timeline, or the methodical way I'd built my portfolio. "Reinvestment," I said simply. "Every profit from events went back into the business. Every successful corporate contract funded the next property acquisition. I've been living off about 30% of my actual income for the past 5 years, putting everything else into expansion." The math of that statement hit the table like cold water. If I'd been living on 30% of my income while maintaining what appeared to be a modest lifestyle, the numbers for my actual earnings became staggering. Ryan was clearly trying to calculate it in his head. Tom looked like he was reconsidering everything he thought he knew about the events industry. But Brad understood immediately. His startup background had taught him about aggressive reinvestment strategies, about founders who lived like students while building million-dollar companies. He was looking at me now with the recognition that comes from meeting a peer, someone who understood the discipline and vision required to build something significant. "That's impressive," he said, and for the first time all evening, there was genuine respect in his voice, rather than condescension. "Most people can't maintain that kind of discipline." I shrugged, the gesture encompassing years of choices that had seemed unremarkable at the time, but had compounded into something extraordinary. "Most people don't have the luxury of being underestimated. When your family thinks you're barely getting by, no one questions why you're not buying expensive cars or taking elaborate vacations." The truth of that observation settled over our table like a revelation. My invisibility hadn't just been a source of pain, it had been a strategic advantage. While everyone worried about Jessica's student loans and career progression, no one had noticed that I was systematically building wealth and acquiring assets. My family's low expectations had provided the perfect cover for ambitious financial planning. Angela was shaking her head slowly. "Emma, this is incredible. But don't you feel angry about how we've all treated you, the assumptions we've made?" It was the question that cut closest to the bone, the one that required me to examine my own motivations for keeping quiet, for allowing the misconceptions to continue, for sitting at the failures table instead of claiming my place among the successful. "Anger is exhausting," I said finally. "And it doesn't compound annually like good investments do." Brad laughed at that, a genuine sound that drew glances from nearby tables. "That might be the most entrepreneurial thing I've heard all night." But even as the atmosphere at our table was shifting from shock to admiration, I could see the larger implications spreading through the reception. Jessica was no longer just glancing in our direction, she was walking toward us, her bridal trailing behind her as she navigated between tables with the determined stride of someone who needed answers immediately. My mother was following a few steps behind, her expression a mixture of confusion and concern that I recognized from childhood, the look she wore when she suspected she'd missed something important but couldn't figure out what it was. The moment of reckoning I'd been postponing for years was approaching, carried forward by the momentum of revelation and the undeniable reality that secrets, once spoken, can't be taken back. I'd wanted one perfect moment of recognition, one instance where the truth could speak for itself without explanation or justification, but truth, I was learning, rarely contained itself to single moments. It demanded expansion, examination, and eventually conversation with the people who thought they knew you best but had never bothered to look closely enough to see who you actually were. Jessica reached our table just as Brad was asking me about my expansion plans for next year. Her face was flushed, whether from the wine, the dancing, or the growing awareness that something significant was happening at the table where she'd seated her disappointing relatives. "Emma," she said, her voice carrying the authoritative tone she'd perfected in her marketing career, "can I talk to you for a minute?" I looked up at my sister, beautiful in her designer gown, surrounded by the wedding she'd dreamed of since we were children playing dress-up in Mom's closet. She deserved this day, this happiness, this perfect beginning to her marriage. But she also deserved the truth about who had made it possible, and why, and what it meant about the assumptions she'd built her sense of superiority upon. "Of course," I said, standing to follow her away from the table, away from Brad's newfound respect and our family's dawning confusion, toward whatever conversation would finally bridge the gap between who I was and who they'd always believed me to be. Jessica led me toward the French doors that opened onto the garden terrace, her heels clicking against the polished marble floors with sharp precision. The terrace was quieter, decorated with string lights that cast a warm glow over the perfectly manicured gardens I'd spent months preparing for this evening. The September air carried the scent of late-blooming roses and the distant sound of laughter from inside the ballroom. "Okay, what the hell is going on?" Jessica turned to face me, her carefully applied makeup still flawless but her composure clearly strained. "People are saying you own this place. Tom Wilson just told Sarah that you have 4 venues. 4 venues, Emma. What is happening?" I leaned against the stone balustrade, taking a moment to appreciate the view I'd fallen in love with during my first walkthrough of the property. The garden stretched toward a small pond that reflected the manor's lights, creating a scene so picturesque it could have graced any wedding magazine cover. It was exactly what Jessica had dreamed of, exactly what had made her eyes light up during that initial venue tour when she thought it was impossibly beyond her reach. "It's true," I said simply. "I bought Rosewood Manor in March. I own 3 other properties as well." Jessica stared at me as if I'd just confessed to living a double life, which in many ways I had. "That's impossible, Emma. You live in that tiny apartment in Astoria, you drive a Honda with 200,000 miles on it. You work for other people's events, you don't own venues." There was something almost desperate in her voice, as if my success somehow threatened the fundamental order of how she understood our family, our roles, our respective places in the world. Jessica had built her identity around being the successful sister, the one who'd made it, the one our parents could be proud of. My revelation wasn't just surprising, it was destabilizing. "I still live in Astoria," I said gently. "I still drive the Honda. Those things don't change just because my bank account looks different." "But why?" Her voice rose slightly, drawing a glance from a couple who'd stepped outside for air. She lowered it immediately, mindful even in her confusion of maintaining appearances at her own wedding. "Why would you live like that if you have money? Why would you let us all think you were struggling?" The question struck at something I'd been examining myself for months, ever since I'd signed the papers to purchase Rosewood Manor. Why had I chosen invisibility over recognition? Why had I allowed my family to maintain their misconceptions about my life when I could have corrected them at any time? "Because struggling wasn't the worst thing you could think about me," I said. Struggling was sympathetic. Struggling meant I was trying but just couldn't quite succeed. If I'd told you I was making more money than Dad ever did, if I'd mentioned owning property and employing people, what would have happened to us? Jessica's face went through several expressions as she processed what I was saying. I could see her remembering conversations, family dinners, moments when she'd made casual comments about my life that now took on entirely different meanings. "You think I would have been jealous?" she asked. "I think you would have been confused," I said honestly. "Your whole life, you've been the one who succeeded visibly, traditionally, in ways that made sense to everyone around us. You got the grades, the scholarships, the corporate job, the promotion. If I'd suddenly revealed that I was building something bigger than anything you'd achieved, how would that have fit into the story our family tells about who we are?" The words hung between us in the cool evening air. It wasn't an accusation exactly, but it was an acknowledgement of dynamics we'd never discussed openly. Jessica had thrived on being the success story, the daughter who'd made it out of Queens and into the kind of life our parents had only dreamed of. My quiet achievements had never threatened that narrative, because no one knew they existed. So you just decided to let me think you were failing. There was hurt in her voice now, layered beneath the confusion and shock. I decided to let you think what you were already thinking, I corrected. I never lied about my work or my life. I just didn't correct your assumptions. When you assumed I was barely getting by, I didn't argue. When you assumed my work was small-scale and unimportant, I didn't elaborate. When you seated me with the failures tonight, I didn't object. Jessica flinched at that last part, clearly remembering her casual dismissal of Table 12 as the place for people who were still figuring things out. The seating arrangement that had seemed like simple logistics an hour ago now looked like something much more pointed, much more revealing about how she'd categorized not just me, but everyone who didn't fit her definition of success. The venue, she said suddenly, her voice quieter now. When we were looking at places and couldn't afford this one, you already owned it. I nodded. You watched me cry about not being able to have my dream wedding here. You listened to me stress about finding something else, something cheaper. You knew the whole time that you could solve it. I did solve it, I pointed out. You're having your dream wedding. You're surrounded by everyone you love in exactly the place you wanted to be. The only difference is that now you know who made it possible. But Jessica was shaking her head, her hands twisting the delicate fabric of her wedding dress. No, Emma, that's not the only difference. The difference is that I spent months feeling grateful to some anonymous payment plan, some miraculous financing option that made this place affordable. I thought we'd gotten lucky, that somehow the universe had aligned to give me this one perfect thing. Her voice was growing stronger, more pointed, as the full implications of what I'd done settled in. Instead, it was you. It was always you. You were watching me struggle with something you could have fixed with a phone call, and you chose not to tell me. The accusation stung because it contained enough truth to cut deep. I had watched her stress about money, about compromises, about the gap between her dreams and her budget. I could have ended that anxiety instantly by revealing my ownership of the property. Instead, I'd chosen a more complex path, one that protected her pride while enabling her dreams, but also maintained my privacy at the cost of her peace of mind. I chose to give you what you wanted without making you feel like you owed me for it, I said. If I'd told you I owned Rosewood Manor, this wouldn't be your wedding anymore. It would be Emma's wedding that Jessica happened to be getting married at. Every photo, every memory, every story you told about this day would include an asterisk about how your sister had to rescue you financially. Jessica was quiet for a long moment, processing what I'd said. In the distance we could hear the band launching into their first dance song, the romantic melody drifting through the French doors, along with the warm glow of chandelier light. Her wedding was continuing without her, the celebration moving forward, while we stood in the garden negotiating years of unspoken tensions and misunderstood motivations. But don't you see how condescending that is? She said finally. You made a decision about what I could or couldn't handle, what would or wouldn't hurt my feelings, without ever asking me. You decided that I was too fragile or too proud to know the truth about my own wedding. She wasn't wrong, and the recognition of that fact hit me like cold water. In my effort to protect Jessica's autonomy and dignity, I'd actually undermined both by making unilateral decisions about what she should or shouldn't know about her own life. My intentions had been good, but the execution had been paternalistic in ways I was only now beginning to understand. You're right, I said. I should have told you. I should have trusted you to handle the truth instead of managing your emotions for you. The admission seemed to surprise her. Jessica had clearly prepared for an argument, for defensiveness, for me to justify my choices with more elaborate explanations. My simple acknowledgement of her point seemed to deflate some of her anger, while leaving space for the hurt underneath to emerge more clearly. I just don't understand why you thought I couldn't handle knowing that my sister was successful, she said, her voice softer now. Do you really think I'm that petty, that insecure? The question was fair, and it forced me to examine my own motivations more honestly than I'd been willing to do before. Had I been protecting Jessica, or had I been protecting myself? Had I been preserving her feelings, or had I been avoiding the complicated conversations that would have come with revealing my success? I think you're human, I said carefully. And I think our family has spent 30 years celebrating your achievements while overlooking mine. Not because anyone was malicious, but because your success looked like success was supposed to look, and mine didn't. When I finally built something that couldn't be overlooked, I wasn't sure how to integrate it into a family dynamic that had never had space for me to be the successful one. Jessica leaned against the terrace railing, her wedding dress pooling around her in elegant folds. The string lights caught the beading on her bodice, making her shimmer like something from a fairy tale. She looked every inch the beautiful bride, but there was something vulnerable in her posture now, something that reminded me of the little girl who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. "Mom's going to lose her mind," she said eventually. I laughed despite myself. "Mom's going to rewrite history. By next week she'll be telling people she always knew I had good business sense." Dad will be proud but confused. He'll want to understand the numbers but won't know how to ask. Uncle Tony will try to get me to invest in whatever scheme he's currently excited about. Ryan will suddenly remember that we're cousins and start asking for job opportunities. We stood there cataloging our family's predictable reactions to my unexpected success, and for a moment it felt like we were children again, united in our understanding of the adults around us. But the moment couldn't last because too much had been revealed, too many assumptions had been overturned, for us to simply return to our old dynamic. "Emma," Jessica said, turning to face me directly, "are you happy, like actually happy with your life?" The question caught me off guard with its directness and its genuine concern. After years of being asked if I was okay or if I needed help, someone was finally asking if I was satisfied with what I'd built. "Yes," I said, and realized I meant it completely. I love what I do. I love the properties I've restored, the events I've created, the team I've built. I love that I can solve problems and create experiences that matter to people. I love that I did it quietly, on my own terms, without having to justify my choices to anyone. Even if it meant being invisible to your own family. The question pierced deeper than she probably intended. The cost of my privacy had indeed been invisibility. The trade-off for building something entirely my own had been building it entirely alone. No family celebrations of my achievements, no shared excitement over new acquisitions, no one to call when I closed a particularly challenging deal or solved a complex logistical problem. The invisibility wasn't the goal, I said. It was just the price I was willing to pay for autonomy. Jessica nodded slowly, as if she was beginning to understand something about the choices I'd made that she hadn't considered before. Inside the ballroom, we could hear applause as the first dance ended, followed by the band's invitation for other couples to join the floor. Her wedding was continuing, the timeline moving forward, the celebration that I'd made possible unfolding exactly as she'd dreamed it would. "We should go back inside," she said. "People are going to start looking for the bride." But she didn't move immediately, and neither did I. We stood in the garden I'd designed for this moment, surrounded by the estate I'd purchased for her dreams, sharing the first honest conversation we'd had about our adult lives, and the different paths we'd chosen to build them. "Thank you," she said, finally. "For this place, for tonight, for making it possible. I know I'm upset about how you did it, but I'm not upset that you did it." "You're welcome," and Emma. "Tomorrow, when all of this settles down, and we're not in crisis mode anymore, I want to see one of your other properties. I want to understand what you've built." The offer surprised me more than anything else she'd said all evening. After years of dismissing my work as party planning, Jessica was asking to see it for what it actually was. After decades of our family treating my achievements as invisible, my sister wanted to make them visible, at least to her. "I'd like that," I said. We walked back toward the French doors together, the bride and the venue owner, the successful sister and the invisible one, both of us changed by the conversation in ways we were only beginning to understand. As we approached the ballroom, I could see our family and friends through the tall windows, dancing and celebrating, unaware that the foundation of their understanding about the Rodriguez sisters had shifted completely in the space of a 20-minute conversation. The band was playing something upbeat now, and couples were swaying across the dance floor I'd refinished just 2 months ago. Brad was back at table 12, gesticulating animatedly, as he spoke to Ryan and Tom, probably sharing some revelation about business strategy or market opportunities. My parents were dancing together, my father's construction calloused hands gentle on my mother's back, as they moved to music in the ballroom their daughter owned. As we stepped back inside, Jessica squeezed my hand briefly before releasing it to return to her role as bride, her smile bright and genuine, as she accepted congratulations and compliments from guests who had no idea they'd just witnessed a fundamental shift in how the guest of honor understood her own family. I watched her glide back into her element, surrounded by love and celebration, and the perfect wedding she'd always dreamed of. Tomorrow, there would be questions and conversations, and the complex work of redefining relationships that had been built on incomplete information. But tonight there was music and dancing, and the satisfaction of watching someone I loved enjoy something I'd made possible. I made my way back toward table 12, where my fellow failures were waiting with expressions of curiosity and newfound respect. But as I walked across the dance floor I owned, through the ballroom I'd restored, past the family who was only now beginning to understand who I actually was, I realized that the most important revelation of the evening hadn't been about my success, or my wealth, or my business acumen. It had been about the difference between being invisible and being private, between hiding and simply not performing, between failure and choosing your own definition of what success should look like. For the first time in years, I felt genuinely seen by the people who mattered most to me, not because I'd changed, but because they'd finally looked closely enough to see what had always been there. When I returned to table 12, the entire dynamic had transformed. Brad was leaning forward in animated conversation with Tom Wilson about venue management software, while Ryan peppered them both with questions about startup funding and business development. Angela had her phone out, clearly researching my properties online, her eyes widening as she scrolled through professional photos of events I'd hosted over the past 5 years. "Emma," Tom said, as I sat down, "Brad was just explaining how your profit margins compare to other hospitality businesses. This is incredible. You've basically created a mini empire while we all thought you were just getting by." The word empire felt both too large and oddly accurate. 4 properties, 37 employees, contracts worth millions of dollars annually. When laid out in stark terms, it did constitute something substantial, something that had grown beyond the modest event planning business my family still imagined I was running. "It's a solid business," I said, settling back into my chair. "But let's not get carried away. I'm still the same person who couldn't afford new tires last year." Brad looked confused. "Wait, if you're generating the kind of revenue we've been discussing, why are you worried about tire costs?" The question revealed how much he still didn't understand about my approach to wealth building. In his world of venture capital and startup exits, success meant lifestyle inflation, visible consumption, the kind of spending that announced your achievements to everyone around you. My strategy had been exactly the opposite: aggressive reinvestment paired with deliberately modest personal spending. Because new tires cost $400, and $400 invested in property improvements generates $800 in additional booking fees over the next year. I explained, when you're building something, every financial decision is about opportunity cost. My Honda runs fine on used tires, but my venues need constant upgrades to stay competitive. Ryan was staring at me with something approaching awe. "You mean you've been living like you're broke while you're actually rich?" "I've been living like someone who understands the difference between net worth and cash flow," I corrected. "Rich is a luxury I'll consider once I've finished building what I'm building." Angela looked up from her phone, her expression thoughtful. "Emma, I've been looking at your venues online. These aren't just event spaces, they're works of art. The restoration work, the attention to detail, the way you've preserved the historical character while adding modern amenities. This is museum-quality work." Her observation touched on something I'd never been able to explain to my family, that my business wasn't just about profit margins and booking rates, though those mattered. It was about preservation, about taking neglected historical properties and breathing new life into them, about creating spaces where people could celebrate the most important moments of their lives, surrounded by beauty and elegance that might otherwise have been lost to demolition or decay. "That's the part I love most," I admitted. "The business side is necessary, but the restoration work is what gets me up in the morning." When I bought Rosewood Manor, the ballroom ceiling had water damage, and half the original moldings were missing. Finding craftsmen who could recreate 19th century plasterwork techniques, sourcing materials that matched the original construction, that's the work that makes everything else worthwhile. Brad was listening with the focused attention of someone recognizing expertise in an area he'd never considered. "How do you balance the historical preservation with modern functionality?"
Guests expect things like reliable Wi-Fi and contemporary sound systems. Very carefully, I said, every modern addition has to be invisible or reversible. We run fiber optic cables through existing conduit systems, hide speakers behind original architectural details, install climate control systems that don't alter the visual aesthetics. It's expensive and time-consuming, but it's the only way to honor what these buildings were, while making them useful for what people need today. Tom was shaking his head in amazement. I've done graphic design work for event venues, and most owners just want everything cheap and fast. What you're describing sounds like a completely different approach to the business. It is, I agreed, and it's why my properties book at premium rates with waiting lists. When couples are planning their wedding, they're not just buying a space for one night, they're buying into a story, a sense of history and permanence that makes their personal milestone feel connected to something larger than themselves. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of my parents, who approached our table with expressions of confusion mixed with curiosity. My mother, Patricia, was still wearing the slightly forced smile she'd maintained all evening, but there was something sharper in her eyes now, a focused attention that suggested she'd been hearing fragments of conversations she didn't understand. Mija, she said, using the Spanish called me since childhood. People are saying very strange things tonight. Mrs. Chen thinks you own this place, which is obviously some kind of misunderstanding. The moment I'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure had finally arrived. My parents, who had spent 30 years categorizing my achievements as disappointments or near misses, were about to learn that their understanding of their daughter's life had been completely wrong for the past 5 years. It's not a misunderstanding, Mom, I said gently. I do own Rosewood Manor. I bought it 6 months ago. My father, Carlos, pulled out a chair and sat down heavily, his weathered hands folded on the table. Emma, what are you talking about? This place must cost
millions of dollars. It did, I confirmed, but it was a good investment. The previous owners were motivated sellers, and I had the capital and industry knowledge to see the potential. Patricia looked around the table as if searching for someone to explain the joke she was missing. Capital? What capital? You work for other people's parties. I work with other people's events, I corrected. But I also own 4 venues across the tri-state area. I've been building this business for 5 years, Mom. Rosewood Manor is my 4th property acquisition. The silence that followed was different from the shocked pause that had greeted my earlier announcement. This was the silence of fundamental worldviews being challenged, of parents realizing that they'd misunderstood their own child so completely that they'd been living in an alternate reality. Carlos spoke first, his voice careful and measured. 4 properties. You're telling me you own 4 properties. The Meadowbrook Estate in Connecticut, Harborview Pavilion on Long Island, Ashford House in New Jersey, and now Rosewood Manor. I said, listing them with the matter-of-fact tone I'd use to discuss any business portfolio. Together, they host about 200 events per year and employ 37 people full-time. Patricia was shaking her head slowly, not in denial but in the bewildered way of someone trying to process information that didn't fit any existing framework. But your apartment, your car, the way you live. The way I choose to live, I emphasized. Every dollar I don't spend on personal expenses is a dollar I can invest in property improvements, marketing, or expansion opportunities. I live modestly because it allows me to build something substantial. My father was studying me with the intense focus he'd once applied to complex electrical problems, trying to understand the connections and systems that had been invisible to him before. How long have you been planning this? This business? 15 years, I said. Since college, really. I started doing event coordination to pay for school, realized I had a talent for it, saw opportunities in the market that other people were missing. Every job taught me something new about the industry, every client connection led to bigger opportunities. 15 years, Patricia repeated faintly. You've been building this for 15 years, and we never knew. The hurt in her voice was unmistakable, and it cut deeper than any anger could have. My mother wasn't just confused about my success, she was wounded by the realization that I'd lived a significant portion of my adult life without sharing it with the people who'd raised me. You never asked, I said simply. When I tried to talk about my work, you changed the subject. When I mentioned business opportunities, you suggested I get a teaching certificate instead. When I bought my first property, you asked if I was sure I could handle the responsibility of a mortgage. Carlos winced at that last part, probably remembering the conversation. We thought we were being protective. You seem to be struggling, taking risks we didn't understand. I was taking calculated risks based on industry knowledge and market analysis, I said. But from the outside, I'm sure it looked like struggling. The difference is that I was struggling towards something specific rather than just struggling to get by. Brad, who had been listening to this family revelation with the fascination of an outsider, spoke up. If I may ask, what's your long-term strategy? Are you planning to continue acquiring properties, or are you looking at other expansion opportunities? The question was directed at me, but it had the effect of including my parents in a conversation about my business plans, forcing them to confront the reality that their daughter had professional goals and strategies that extended far beyond their understanding or involvement. I'm considering a management company model, I said. Instead of just acquiring properties, I could offer comprehensive event management services to venues that want to upgrade their operations without selling. It would allow me to expand the business without the capital requirements of constant property acquisition. Patricia was staring at me as if I were speaking a foreign language. You talk like a businesswoman. I am a businesswoman, Mom. The simple statement hung in the air between us, carrying the weight of years of misunderstood identity and unrecognized achievement. I was a businesswoman. I had been for years. I employed people, managed budgets, made strategic decisions, generated revenue, and created value in the marketplace. The fact that my parents were surprised by this reality said more about their assumptions than it did about my capabilities. Jessica knew about this, Carlos asked. Jessica found out tonight, about 10 minutes before you did. He nodded slowly, processing the timeline and implications. So when she was worried about affording this place for the wedding, I made sure she could afford it, I confirmed. She didn't need to know how. She just needed to have her dream wedding without financial stress. Patricia's expression was cycling through confusion, hurt, pride, and something that might have been embarrassment. Emma, why didn't you trust us with this? We're your family. The question deserved an honest answer, even if it was painful to give. Because every time I tried to share professional achievements with this family, they were minimized or dismissed. Because when I mentioned business opportunities, I was advised to be more realistic. Because when Jessica got promoted, we threw parties, but when I landed major clients, the conversation moved on to other topics. That's not fair, Patricia said, but her protest lacked conviction. It's exactly fair, Angela said quietly, speaking up from across the table. I've watched this family for 20 years, Patricia. Emma's right. You celebrate Jessica's achievements and you worry about Emma's choices. You never considered that Emma might be succeeding beyond anything Jessica has accomplished. The observation from an outsider carried weight that my own words couldn't, forcing my parents to see their family dynamics from a perspective they'd never considered. Angela had been present for years of holiday dinners and birthday celebrations, witnessing firsthand how success was celebrated when it looked traditional and overlooked when it didn't. Carlos was quiet for a long moment, his electrician's mind probably working through the practical implications of what I'd revealed. 4 properties, he said finally. That's serious money, serious responsibility. You employ 37 people. 37 full-time employees, plus seasonal and event-specific staff. During peak wedding season, we're closer to 60 people. And you manage all of that yourself. I have excellent managers at each property, but yes, I oversee operations, marketing, financial planning, and strategic development for the whole portfolio. He nodded slowly, recognition dawning in his eyes. You're not working for other people anymore. Other people work for you. That's right. The shift in his understanding was visible, moving from seeing me as someone who helped with parties to recognizing me as someone who ran a substantial business operation. For a man who'd spent 40 years working for other people, the transition from employee to employer represented a fundamental change in status and authority. I'm proud of you, he said simply, and the words hit me harder than I'd expected. Patricia was still processing, still struggling with the gap between her perceptions and reality. But you never acted successful. You never talked about money or showed off what you were building. Because showing off wasn't the goal, I explained. Building something sustainable was the goal. Having the freedom to make my own decisions was the goal. Creating something that could last and grow and provide security for decades to come was the goal. And now, she asked. What happens now that we know? It was a fair question, and one I'd been considering since the moment I decided to reveal my ownership of Rosewood Manor. What would change now that my family understood who I actually was? How would our relationships shift when they could no longer dismiss my achievements or worry about my financial stability? Now we see if you can be as proud of what I've actually built as you were worried about what you thought I was failing to build, I said. The band had transitioned to slower music, and couples were swaying gently across the dance floor. Jessica was dancing with Michael, her head resting on his shoulder, completely content in the moment and the space I'd created for her happiness. The wedding was winding toward its successful conclusion, the evening I'd planned and financed and enabled moving forward exactly as it should. Brad stood up from the table, extending his hand to me in a gesture that was both professional courtesy and personal apology. "Emma, it's been a pleasure meeting you. I mean that sincerely. I'm sorry for my earlier assumptions." I shook his hand, appreciating the directness of his acknowledgement. "No harm done. It's been an educational evening for everyone. I'd love to continue our conversation about expansion strategies sometime if you're interested. What you've built is impressive, and I think there might be some interesting synergies between your industry knowledge and our data analytics capabilities." The offer was genuine, the respect in his voice real. Brad had entered the evening seeing me as a failure worth dismissing, and was leaving it recognizing me as a peer worth cultivating. The transformation was complete, visible, and satisfying in ways I'd never anticipated. As the reception moved into its final hour, I found myself standing near the French doors again, watching my family and friends celebrate in the space I'd restored, and the business I'd built. The revelation was spreading through the remaining guests in whispered conversations and surprised exclamations. But the fundamental purpose of the evening, celebrating Jessica and Michael's marriage, remained unchanged. Ryan approached me as I stood there, his expression a mixture of admiration and sheepishness. "Emma, I owe you an apology. We all do really. I had no idea what you were accomplishing." "You don't owe me anything, Ryan. I chose not to share what I was building. I can't blame people for not knowing what I didn't tell them. But we could have asked better questions. We could have been more interested in your work instead of just assuming it wasn't important." His insight was more mature than I'd expected, suggesting that tonight's revelations had prompted some serious reflection among my family members. Maybe, but maybe it worked out the way it needed to. I got to build something without expectations or interference, and you all get to be surprised by what I created. Are things going to be different now? Between all of us, it was the question everyone was probably wondering, but afraid to ask directly. Would knowing about my success change our family dynamics? Would it create new tensions or resolve old ones? Would I continue living modestly while building wealth, or would this revelation mark a transition to a different kind of life? "I hope things will be more honest," I said. "I hope we can talk about our actual lives instead of the versions we think other people want to hear about. But fundamentally, I'm still the same person I was this morning. I just own the building we're standing in." As the evening wound down and guests began saying their goodbyes, I watched Jessica and Michael prepare for their departure. She looked radiant in her going-away outfit, still glowing with the happiness of a perfect wedding day. As they made their rounds thanking family and friends, Jessica caught my eye and smiled. Not the polite, slightly condescending smile I'd grown used to, but something warmer and more genuine. "Thank you," she mouthed across the room, and I knew she meant more than just the venue or the financial assistance. She was thanking me for the conversation we'd had, for the honesty we'd finally shared, for the foundation we'd built for a different kind of relationship going forward. The last guests filtered out into the cool September night, and the catering staff began their efficient cleanup process. I stayed behind to handle the final details, reviewing the evening with my event manager, and ensuring that every aspect of the celebration had met our standards. It was work I loved, the satisfaction of executing a complex event flawlessly, of creating an experience that would live in people's memories for decades. My parents were among the last to leave, lingering as if they weren't quite ready to return to a world where their understanding of their daughter had been completely transformed. Patricia hugged me goodbye with unusual emotion, holding on a moment longer than usual. "We're proud of you, Mia," she whispered. "We should have said that years ago." Carlos shook my hand formally, then pulled me into a hug that smelled like aftershave and the satisfaction of a job well done. "You did good, Emma, better than good. You did something special." As I locked up Rosewood Manor and walked to my Honda with its worn seats and 200,000 miles, I reflected on the strange satisfaction of the evening's revelations. I'd spent years building something substantial while allowing my family to believe I was barely getting by. Tonight I'd allowed them to discover the truth, not through grand announcements or careful explanations, but through the natural progression of events that had made concealment impossible. The drive home to my modest apartment in Astoria felt different, though nothing about my circumstances had actually changed. I was still the same person driving the same car to the same address, but the weight of maintaining misconceptions was gone, replaced by the lighter feeling of being known and understood, at least by the people who mattered most. Tomorrow, there would be questions and conversations and the complex work of rebuilding relationships on foundations of truth, rather than assumption. There would be requests for business advice, invitations to family dinners, where my achievements could be celebrated rather than overlooked, and probably some uncomfortable reckonings with years of dismissive comments and casual condescension. But tonight, there was simply the satisfaction of having built something beautiful and sustainable and meaningful, of having created spaces where people could celebrate the most important moments of their lives, and of having finally been seen for who I actually was, rather than who others had assumed me to be. Sometimes the most powerful revelations come not from dramatic confrontations or carefully planned announcements, but from the simple decision to stop hiding what you've accomplished, and allow others to discover the truth in their own time. Sometimes the best response to being underestimated is simply to continue building something so substantial that it becomes impossible to ignore. And sometimes the greatest success isn't measured in profit margins or property values, or the size of your business empire, but in the moment when the people who love you finally understand what you've been working toward all along, and recognize that what they thought was failure was actually the quiet, determined construction of exactly the life you wanted to build. 6 months after Jessica's wedding, I stood in the renovated carriage house of what would become my 5th property, watching craftsmen install hand-forged wrought iron fixtures that matched the original 1890s architecture. The Whitmore estate in the Hudson Valley had been abandoned for 3 years before I acquired it. Its grand ballroom flooded, its gardens overgrown, its reputation as a premier wedding destination seemingly lost forever. Now sunlight streamed through newly restored stained glass windows, illuminating walls that had been carefully stripped and replastered using techniques that honored the building's original construction. The project had taken 8 months of intensive renovation, but in 2 weeks we would host our first event since the acquisition, a corporate retreat for a Manhattan investment firm that had specifically requested a venue with both historical character and modern amenities. My phone buzzed with a text from Jessica. "Are you free for lunch? I'm driving up to see the new place." Our relationship had evolved considerably since her wedding night revelations. She'd kept her promise to visit my other properties, spending entire afternoons at each venue, while I explained the restoration process, the business model, and the strategic thinking behind each acquisition. What had started as curiosity had developed into genuine admiration for what I'd built, and more importantly, into a friendship between two adults who finally understood each other's actual lives. "Kitchen is functional but still under construction," I texted back. "Bring sandwiches and I'll give you the full tour." While waiting for her arrival, I walked through the main ballroom, checking on the progress of the floor refinishing. The original heart pine planks had been damaged by years of water exposure, but a specialty restoration company had managed to save about 70% of the original wood, while seamlessly integrating new planks that matched the grain and patina. The result was a floor that looked authentically aged while being structurally sound enough to support decades of future celebrations. This was the work that truly energized me, taking something broken and forgotten, and bringing it back to life in a way that preserved its essential character while making it functional for contemporary needs. Each venue presented unique challenges, from structural issues to historical preservation requirements, to the complex logistics of integrating modern systems into 19th century buildings. The Whitmore estate had been particularly challenging because of its size and condition. The main house featured 12 rooms that could be configured for different event needs, from intimate ceremonies to grand receptions. The grounds included formal gardens, a small chapel, and guest accommodations that would allow us to host multi-day events. But the scale of the renovation had required bringing in specialists from across the region, coordinating multiple contractors, and managing a budget that would have seemed impossible to me just 5 years earlier. Jessica arrived as I was reviewing electrical plans with the site supervisor, her designer handbag and tailored coat, a sharp contrast to my work boots and dust-covered jeans. She'd started dressing more professionally since her promotion to marketing director, a role she'd earned 3 months after her wedding, through a combination of excellent work and newfound confidence that seemed to stem from understanding her place in a larger family context. "This is incredible, Emma," she said, looking around the ballroom with genuine awe. "When you said it was a major renovation, I didn't realize you meant rebuilding from the foundation up." "Not quite from the foundation," I corrected, "but close. The structural bones were solid, but everything else needed attention. New electrical, new plumbing, climate control systems that won't damage the historical elements, modern kitchen facilities that can handle large-scale catering." She pulled out her phone and started taking photos, something she'd begun doing at all my properties. At first I'd thought it was just social media documentation, but I'd realized she was genuinely interested in the work itself, in understanding how someone could look at a deteriorating building and see potential rather than problems. "How do you know it's going to work?" she asked. "I mean, how do you look at a place like this and feel confident that you can make it profitable?" It was a question she'd asked in various forms during each of her visits, and I'd come to understand that she wasn't just curious about my business strategy. She was trying to understand how someone develops the confidence to take risks on that scale, to commit substantial resources to projects that might not succeed. "Market research, financial modeling, industry knowledge," I said, leading her toward the kitchen area, where contractors were installing commercial-grade appliances, but also intuition about what people want from their most important celebrations. Couples aren't just buying a venue for their wedding, they're buying into a story, a sense of place and permanence that makes their personal milestone feel connected to something larger than themselves. And corporate clients, they want something that impresses without being ostentatious, that feels exclusive without being pretentious. A place where they can build relationships and close deals in an environment that suggests success and tradition. Jessica nodded, making notes on her phone. "It's like marketing, but with buildings instead of campaigns." The comparison was more accurate than she probably realized. Both marketing and venue management required understanding target audiences, creating compelling narratives, and delivering experiences that exceeded expectations while managing complex logistics behind the scenes. We sat on the front steps of the main house to eat our sandwiches, overlooking gardens that would be in full bloom by the time our first wedding season began. The Hudson Valley stretched out below us, a landscape of rolling hills and distant mountains that provided a dramatic backdrop for any celebration. "Mom's been telling everyone about your business," Jessica said between bites of her turkey sandwich. "I think she's mentioned your 5 venues to every person she's encountered in the past month." I laughed, imagining our mother's pride finally finding an outlet after years of not knowing how to explain what I did for work. 5 venues sounds more impressive than it is. This one won't be operational for another month, and it's really just 4 established properties, plus 1 major renovation project. "Don't minimize it," Jessica said firmly. "What you've built is extraordinary, Emma. I've seen your other properties now. I understand the scope of what you're managing. This isn't just impressive, it's remarkable." The acknowledgement meant more than she probably knew. For years I'd been the sister whose achievements were either unknown or dismissed. Having Jessica recognize the scale and complexity of my work, having her visit my properties, and ask informed questions about my business strategy, had created a foundation for respect that had never existed between us before. "How are things at your agency?" I asked, shifting the conversation toward her professional life. "Good, really good, actually. The promotion came with a lot more responsibility, but I feel ready for it in a way I didn't before." She paused, considering her words. "I think knowing about your success has made me more confident about my own abilities." Does that make sense? It did make sense, though perhaps not in the way she intended. Jessica had spent years being the successful sister in a family that celebrated her achievements while overlooking mine. Learning that I'd been building something substantial while everyone thought I was struggling had recontextualized her own accomplishments, making them feel more genuine, rather than simply relative to my perceived failures. "You were always capable of more than you were doing," I said. "Maybe now you just feel permission to show it." Maybe, or maybe seeing what you accomplished without any family support made me realize I was underutilizing the support I did have.
The observation was insightful, revealing how our family dynamics had limited both of us in different ways. My invisibility had given me freedom, but cost me encouragement and celebration. Jessica's visibility had given her confidence, but also pressure to maintain a level of success that fit everyone else's expectations. "Have you thought about what comes next?" she asked. "After this place is operational, I mean. Are you planning to keep expanding?" It was a question I'd been considering seriously, as the Whitmore renovation neared completion. 5 properties represented a significant portfolio, but they also represented the upper limit of what I could manage personally, while maintaining the quality standards that had built my reputation. Further expansion would require different strategies, hiring additional management staff, developing systems that could operate independently of my direct oversight, or transitioning to a different business model entirely. "I'm exploring options," I said carefully. "There's interest from other venue owners in having me consult on their operations, which could be a way to grow the business without taking on additional property debt. Or I could develop a management company model, where I provide comprehensive event services to venues that want to upgrade without selling." That sounds like it could be huge. It could be, but it would also change the nature of what I do. Right now I know every detail of every property, every event, every client relationship. Scaling up would mean delegating more, which would be more profitable but less personally satisfying. Jessica was quiet for a moment, processing what I'd said. "You really love the hands-on work, don't you? The restoration, the direct client contact, the problem solving." "I do. There's something deeply satisfying about taking a space that's been forgotten or neglected and making it beautiful again. Then watching people create their most important memories there. It's like you're not just running a business, you're preserving history and creating experiences at the same time." The insight was exactly right, capturing something about my motivation that I'd never been able to articulate clearly. Each venue I'd acquired and restored was both a business investment and a preservation project, both a profit center and a contribution to maintaining architectural and cultural heritage that might otherwise be lost. My phone rang, interrupting our lunch. The caller ID showed my event coordinator at Harborview Pavilion, probably calling with questions about the weekend's wedding preparation. As I answered, I gestured apologetically to Jessica, who waved me off and continued taking photos of the Whitmore estate's exterior detail. "Emma, we have a situation," my coordinator said. Without preamble, the bride for Saturday's wedding just called. Her original photographer canceled due to a family emergency, and she's panicking about finding a replacement on such short notice. This was exactly the kind of crisis that required the personal attention I'd been discussing with Jessica. A venue owner focused purely on profit margins might simply express sympathy and refer the client to a list of recommended vendors. But my business model was built on creating flawless experiences, which meant solving problems that technically weren't my responsibility, but absolutely were my concern. "What's her budget for photography?" I asked, mentally reviewing my list of professional contacts. "She's flexible on price, but not on quality. This is their dream wedding, and they've been planning for 18 months. Give me 20 minutes. I'll have 3 options for her to choose from, all available Saturday, and all capable of delivering the quality she wants." As I hung up and started scrolling through my contacts, Jessica watched with obvious curiosity. "Crisis management, photography emergency for Saturday's wedding. The original photographer had a family situation, and you're personally finding a replacement. That's what we do. When someone books with us, they're not just renting a
space, they're buying peace of mind. We handle whatever comes up so they can focus on getting married." Jessica shook her head in amazement. "No wonder your venue's booked so far in advance. You're not just providing a location, you're providing a complete service experience." Within 15 minutes, I'd contacted 3 photographers I'd worked with before, confirmed their availability, and sent their portfolios to my coordinator. The bride would have excellent options by the end of the day, her crisis would be resolved, and her wedding would proceed exactly as planned. It was the kind of behind-the-scenes problem-solving that clients never saw but that built the reputation for reliability that kept my business thriving. "Does that happen often?" Jessica asked, as we finished our lunch. "Something like that happens with every event. Vendor cancellations, weather issues, family drama, last-minute changes to guest counts. The venue business isn't just about having beautiful spaces, it's about being able to adapt quickly when things don't go according to plan. How do you manage the stress of that much responsibility?" The question made me consider something I'd never examined closely. How did I handle the pressure of being responsible for other people's most important celebrations? What happened when my business decisions affected not just profit margins but personal memories that would last a lifetime? I think the responsibility is what makes it meaningful, I said finally. Anyone can rent out a building, but creating experiences that people will remember for the rest of their lives, that's work worth doing well. As we prepared to leave, Jessica asked if she could walk through the main house one more time, taking additional photos and asking detailed questions about the restoration process. Her interest had evolved from polite curiosity to genuine fascination with the complexity of what I'd undertaken. The wedding planner in me is completely amazed by this, she said as we stood in what would become the bridal preparation suite. The level of detail, the way you've thought through every aspect of how events will flow through these spaces, it's like you've designed a machine for creating perfect celebrations. That's exactly what it is, I agreed. Every room, every corridor, every sightline has been planned with specific purposes in mind. Where photographers will get the best lighting, how catering staff will move efficiently between kitchen and reception areas, where guests will naturally gather during cocktail hour. And you figured all of this out through experience. Through experience research, and a lot of conversations with people who work in every aspect of the events industry. Photographers taught me about lighting requirements, caterers helped me understand kitchen workflows, musicians explained acoustics considerations. Every event I've coordinated has been a learning opportunity. As we walked back to our cars, Jessica paused in the circular driveway, looking back at the Whitmore estate with an expression I couldn't quite read. "What are you thinking?" I asked. "I'm thinking about how different our lives turned out from what anyone expected when we were kids. You were the quiet one who helped with family parties, and now you own 5 venues and employ dozens of people. I was the academic star, and I'm working in marketing for someone else's company." "There's nothing wrong with working for someone else's company," I pointed out. "You're excellent at what you do, you're making good money, and you have security and benefits I don't have as a business owner. I know, and I'm not unhappy with my career. It's just interesting how success can look so different from what we imagined it would be." The observation was profound in its simplicity. Neither of us had achieved the lives we'd envisioned as children, but both of us had found ways to build meaningful careers that utilized our strengths and provided satisfaction beyond just financial security. "Are you proud of what you've built?" she asked as we reached our cars. "Yes," I said without hesitation. "For the first time in my adult life, I can say that honestly. I'm proud of the properties I've restored, the team I've assembled, the experiences I've created for thousands of people over the past 5 years." "Good," Jessica said, hugging me goodbye. "You should be. What you've accomplished is extraordinary, Emma. I'm proud to be your sister." As I watched her drive away, I reflected on how much our relationship had changed since her wedding night. The revelation of my business success had initially been about correcting misconceptions and claiming recognition I'd been denied. But the deeper transformation had been in developing a genuine adult friendship based on mutual respect and understanding, rather than childhood roles and family expectations. My phone buzzed with a text from my photographer coordinator. "Bride chose photographer #2. Crisis averted. Saturday wedding back on track." I smiled, feeling the familiar satisfaction of problems solved and celebrations preserved. This was the work I'd chosen, the life I'd built through 15 years of careful planning and strategic risk-taking. It wasn't the conventional success that my family had once celebrated in Jessica, but it was success that I'd defined on my own terms and achieved through my own vision. The sun was setting over the Hudson Valley as I locked up the Whitmore estate and headed back to my Honda. In 2 weeks, this space would be filled with corporate executives, building business relationships over cocktails and dinner. In 6 months, it would host its first wedding, another couple's dream celebration in a space I'd rescued from decay and abandonment. Tomorrow I would return to review final details with contractors, address any remaining issues before our first event, and continue the meticulous work of bringing another venue to operational excellence. It was work that required constant attention, ongoing investment, and the kind of personal commitment that left little room for traditional work-life balance. But as I drove through the gathering darkness toward my modest apartment in Astoria, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from building something substantial and meaningful, from creating spaces where people's most important moments could unfold with beauty and grace. I'd found a way to combine business success with historical preservation, financial achievement with meaningful work, personal fulfillment with professional recognition. The girl who'd been seated at table 12 with the failures had turned out to own not just the venue but the vision, the strategy, and the determination to build something that would last long after any single celebration ended. Sometimes the most powerful success is the kind that doesn't need to announce itself, the kind that speaks through results rather than rhetoric, the kind that transforms not just bank accounts but buildings, not just profit margins but people's most precious memories. And sometimes the best validation isn't the moment when everyone finally understands what you've accomplished, but the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you've built exactly the life you wanted to build, exactly the way you wanted to build it, with exactly the values and vision that have always guided your choices. 2 years later, I stood at the podium of the Northeast Venue Owners Conference, looking out at an audience of 300 hospitality professionals who had gathered to hear me speak about sustainable business growth in the events industry. The irony wasn't lost on me. The woman who had spent years being invisible to her own family was now addressing an industry conference as a recognized expert in venue management and historical preservation. The key to successful venue acquisition, I said, advancing to my next slide, isn't just identifying undervalued properties, it's understanding the story each space wants to tell, and finding clients who want to be part of that narrative. In the audience, I spotted several faces I recognized from my network of industry contacts, including 2 venue owners who had recently hired my consulting firm to optimize their operations. What had started as casual conversations about business strategy had evolved into a formal consulting practice that now generated more revenue than my property portfolio, allowing me to expand my influence without taking on additional debt. The presentation covered case studies from all 5 of my venues, including the Whitmore Estate, which had become my most successful property within 18 months of opening. The Hudson Valley location had attracted not just local clients but destination weddings from across the Northeast, couples who specifically sought out venues with both historical character and impeccable service standards. After my presentation, I was approached by a woman in her 40s, who introduced herself as Maria Santos, owner of a struggling venue in Connecticut. Miss Rodriguez, I've been following your work since the industry magazine featured your Rosewood Manor restoration. I'm wondering if you might be interested in a consulting arrangement for my property. We exchanged business cards and scheduled a preliminary assessment meeting, another potential client for the consulting practice that had grown organically from other venue owners, seeking advice about everything from marketing strategies to renovation planning. What had begun as informal conversations between industry colleagues had developed into a systematic approach to helping other venue owners maximize their property's potential. The conference concluded with a networking reception, where I found myself in conversations about market trends, technological innovations, and the challenges of maintaining historical properties in an increasingly competitive industry. It was work I'd never imagined when I'd started coordinating corporate events 15 years earlier, but it felt like a natural evolution of the expertise I'd developed through trial and error. My phone buzzed with a text from Jessica. "Watching your presentation online. You're amazing up there. Call me when you're done, I have news." I stepped outside the hotel to call her back, curious about what news she might have. Our relationship had continued to strengthen over the past 2 years, evolving into a genuine friendship that included regular conversations about both business and personal matters. "Emma, you're not going to believe this," Jessica said as soon as she answered. "I got the promotion, Senior Director of Marketing, effective immediately. And there's more, they want me to lead the team that's developing marketing strategies for luxury brands." "That's incredible, Jess. Congratulations. You've earned this." "Thanks, but here's the really crazy part. They specifically mentioned your business as an example of the kind of luxury brand strategy they want to develop. Apparently, someone on the executive team has been following your consulting work and thinks your approach to storytelling and client experience could translate to other industries." The connection was unexpected, but not entirely surprising. The principles I'd developed for venue marketing, understanding target audiences, creating compelling narratives, delivering experiences that exceeded expectations, were indeed transferable to other luxury service industries. "Are you saying they want to use my business model as a case study?" "I'm saying they want to hire you as a consultant to help develop their luxury marketing framework." "Emma, this could be huge for both of us." The opportunity represented another evolution in my career trajectory, from venue owner to industry consultant to business strategy advisor, for companies outside the hospitality sector. It was the kind of growth that would have seemed impossible when I was sitting at table 12, dismissed as one of the family failures. Send me the details, I said. Let's see what they have in mind. As I hung up and prepared to return to the networking reception, I reflected on how dramatically my professional life had changed since Jessica's wedding. The revelation of my business success had been just the beginning of a larger transformation that had included public speaking, industry recognition, and opportunities I'd never anticipated. But perhaps more importantly, it had changed how I understood my own capabilities and potential. For years I'd been content to build quietly and privately, focused solely on creating successful venues without seeking broader recognition or influence. The experience of being seen and acknowledged by my family had opened possibilities I'd never considered: speaking engagements, consulting opportunities, and the chance to influence an entire industry's approach to client experience and business development. 6 months later, I was back at Rosewood Manor, but this time for a very different kind of event. My consulting firm was hosting its first annual client retreat, bringing together venue owners from across the Northeast for 2 days of workshops, networking, and strategic planning sessions. The ballroom where I'd once been seated with the failures was now filled with successful business owners who had specifically sought out my expertise. The irony was delicious. The space where I'd first claimed recognition for my achievements had become the headquarters for a business that helped others achieve similar success. Jessica arrived early for the opening reception, her new role having given her both the confidence and the credibility to attend industry events as my guest. She'd become genuinely interested in the hospitality business, not as a potential career change, but as a way to understand the strategic thinking behind successful luxury brands. "This is surreal," she said, looking around the ballroom. 2.5 years ago, we were both sitting at that table over there, and you were just another family member who worked in events. Now you're addressing an audience of your peers as a recognized industry. Not just peers, I corrected. Many of these people are actually clients now. The consulting business has grown beyond what I ever imagined. The retreat featured presentations on everything from digital marketing strategies to sustainable renovation practices, but the most popular sessions were the ones where I shared specific case studies from my own venue acquisitions and restorations. Participants wanted to understand not just what I'd accomplished, but how I'd developed the vision and confidence to undertake such ambitious projects. During the cocktail reception, I was approached by a young woman who introduced herself as Carmen Vega, a recent hospitality management graduate who was considering starting her own venue business. "Rodriguez, I've been following your career trajectory, and I'm wondering if you have any advice for someone just starting out in this industry." The question reminded me of my own early years, when I'd been building my business through trial and error without mentors or industry guidance. I'd succeeded through persistence and strategic thinking, but the path had been lonely and uncertain in ways that didn't have to be repeated by the next generation of venue entrepreneurs. "Start with one property and do it exceptionally well," I said. "Don't try to build an empire immediately. Focus on understanding every aspect of the business, operations, marketing, client relations, vendor management, before you consider expansion. How do you maintain quality standards as you grow? By hiring excellent people and trusting them to execute your vision." The biggest mistake venue owners make is trying to personally manage every detail of every event. You have to learn when to delegate and when to stay involved. As the evening continued, I found myself in similar conversations with multiple attendees, sharing insights and advice that had been hard-won through years of experience. It was satisfying in ways I hadn't anticipated, contributing to other people's success while building a reputation as someone who could help navigate the complexities of the hospitality industry. Near the end of the reception, I stepped outside onto the terrace where Jessica and I had our crucial conversation during her wedding. The garden looked exactly as it had that September evening, but everything else had changed: my relationship with my family, my professional reputation, my understanding of what was possible when you stopped hiding your capabilities behind false modesty. Jessica joined me outside, carrying 2 glasses of wine from the reception. "Penny, for your thoughts. I was thinking about that conversation we had out here during your wedding. How angry you were that I hadn't told you about owning the venue." "I wasn't angry about you owning it," she corrected. "I was angry about feeling like you didn't trust me enough to share something so important. And now I understand why you made the choices you did. You needed to build something that was entirely yours before you could share it with anyone else, including family." The insight was accurate, and more profound than she probably realized. For years I'd needed the freedom to succeed or fail, based entirely on my own decisions, without the weight of family expectations, or the pressure to justify my choices to people who might not understand them. The privacy had been protective, allowing me to develop confidence and expertise without external judgment. "Do you ever regret waiting so long to tell us?" she asked. I considered the question carefully. I regret that it meant missing out on support and encouragement during the building years. But I don't regret having the freedom to make mistakes and learn from them without having to explain myself to anyone. And now that you're successful enough that it can't be questioned, now I can share it without feeling defensive or having to prove anything. Success speaks for itself in ways that potential never could. As we prepared to return inside, Jessica paused at the French doors. "Emma, I want you to know something. What you've accomplished, not just the business success, but the way you've maintained your values and vision throughout the growth, it's changed how I think about my own career goals." "How so?" "You've shown me that it's possible to build something meaningful without compromising who you are. That success doesn't have to look like what other people expect it to look like." The conversation was interrupted by Carmen Vega, who approached with obvious excitement. "Miss Rodriguez, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I wanted to thank you for your advice earlier. I've been thinking about what you said about starting with one property, and I think I've found the perfect place." She showed me photos on her phone of a small estate in Vermont that had been on the market for 6 months. The property was smaller than my venues, but had good bones and excellent potential for intimate weddings and corporate retreats. More importantly, it was priced within reach of someone just starting in the business. "What's your timeline?" I asked, studying the photos with professional interest. "I could close within 60 days, if the inspection goes well. I've been saving for 3 years, and I have enough capital for the purchase and basic renovations." "Have you thought about your marketing strategy? Your target demographic?" That's where I could use guidance. I know I want to focus on smaller, more intimate events, but I'm not sure how to position myself in a market that already has several established venues. I handed her my business card. "Call my office next week. I think we might be able to help you develop a business plan that differentiates your property while building on your strengths." As Carmen walked away, clearly thrilled by the offer of professional guidance, Jessica shook her head in amazement. "You're not just running your own business anymore. You're developing the next generation of venue owners. It's the natural evolution of the consulting work, and it's incredibly rewarding to help someone avoid the mistakes I made while learning the business." The retreat concluded the following afternoon, with a strategic planning session, where participants worked in small groups to develop action plans for implementing the strategies we discussed. The energy in the room was palpable. Venue owners, who had arrived with specific challenges, were leaving with concrete solutions and renewed enthusiasm for their businesses. As the last participants departed, I walked through the empty ballroom, where I'd built my reputation from a single moment of strategic revelation. The space that had once represented my invisibility had become the launching pad for influence I'd never imagined possible. My event coordinator approached with the final attendance numbers and feedback scores from the retreat evaluations. "Emma, these results are incredible. 97% rated the overall experience as excellent, and we already have requests to expand next year's program to 3 days. What kind of expansion are they looking for?" "More hands-on workshops, property visits to see your renovation work in person, and some kind of ongoing mentorship program for new venue owners." The suggestions represented yet another evolution in how my business could grow and influence the industry. From owning venues, to consulting on operations, to potentially developing formal education programs for hospitality entrepreneurs, each step had grown organically from the previous one, building on expertise and reputation, rather than requiring dramatic pivots or wholesale changes in direction. That evening I drove home to my apartment in Astoria, which I'd kept despite having the financial means to upgrade significantly. The modest space had become a deliberate choice, rather than a financial necessity, a reminder of the values and priorities that had guided my business development from the beginning. On my kitchen table was a stack of consulting proposals from potential new clients, speaking engagement invitations from industry conferences across the country, and a formal offer from a major hospitality management company that wanted to acquire my consulting firm for a sum that would have seemed impossible to imagine just 3 years earlier. I set the paperwork aside without immediate review.
preferring to savor the satisfaction of another successful event before diving into decisions about future opportunities. The retreat had reinforced something I'd been learning gradually over the past 2 years: that success, real success, wasn't just about achieving financial goals or gaining industry recognition. It was about building something that created value for other people while remaining true to your own vision and values. It was about growing in ways that enhanced rather than compromised what made your work meaningful. It was about maintaining the curiosity and commitment to excellence that had driven your initial success, even as opportunities expanded beyond your original ambitions. Most importantly, it was about remembering that the girl who had been seated at table 12 with the failures hadn't actually been failing at all. She'd been building something substantial and meaningful in the only way she knew how: quietly, strategically, and with absolute determination to create exactly the life and career she wanted, regardless of whether anyone else understood or appreciated what she was accomplishing. Sometimes the most powerful success stories aren't about dramatic transformations or sudden breakthroughs. Sometimes they're about the patient, persistent work of building something excellent while maintaining the vision and values that make the work worth doing in the first place. And sometimes the greatest victory isn't in proving wrong the people who underestimated you, but in building something so substantial and meaningful that their opinions become irrelevant to your sense of accomplishment and purpose. The woman who owned 5 venues, consulted for dozens more, and influenced an entire industry's approach to client experience had been there all along, waiting for the right moment to step out of the shadows and claim her place among the leaders and innovators who were shaping the future of hospitality. She just needed one perfect moment, one strategic revelation, one sentence delivered with quiet confidence to remind everyone, including herself, that failure and invisibility aren't the same thing, and that sometimes the most successful people are the ones who've been building empires while everyone else was busy looking elsewhere. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.